The air above Tunisia shimmered with heat and death. The sun was merciless, a white coin in a washed-out sky, and beneath it, the once-proud 21st Panzer Division was disintegrating. What had been a column of tanks and trucks that morning was now a wreckage of twisted metal, scorched sand, and men staggering in disbelief. The Luftwaffe had promised air support, but the skies were full of American P-38s instead, their engines screaming like vultures over the dying. Oberleutnant Hans Keller crouched behind the smoking carcass of a Panzer III, his pistol slick with sweat. His uniform was blackened with dust and oil. His pride, though, still glowed like a live coal. Around him, the last dozen survivors of his platoon waited in the dry silence that follows chaos, that terrifying moment when the battle stops and you realize you've lost. A distant rumble of engines grew louder. Shermans, muttered Feldwebel Otto Meissner, spitting into the sand. Americans again, they don't stop coming. Hans squinted toward the horizon. Through the heat haze, the enemy tanks were crawling forward, squat, ugly machines but unstoppable, like rolling factories. And behind them, columns of trucks. The Americans never ran out of anything, not fuel, not shells, not cigarettes. It infuriated him. They fight with money, Otto growled. They fight with machines, Hans corrected, holstering his pistol. And machines don't get tired. From the left flank, the sound of automatic fire stuttered, then stopped. A voice shouted in accented German, "Hände hoch, hands up." Hans froze. The voice was calm, confident, not the usual nervous bark of green soldiers. He rose slowly, raising both hands, and saw the shapes emerging through the heat. American infantry, dusty but alert, rifles steady. Their uniforms weren't as sharp as the German ones, loose sleeves, rolled cuffs, helmets scuffed, yet something about them radiated strength. They were practical men, not parading soldiers. One of them, a tall sergeant with a square jaw and a half-smoked cigarette hanging from his lip, walked forward. His M1 carbine was lowered, but not by much. "Any of you boys planning to make this difficult?" he asked, his English rough but easy. Hans's men exchanged glances. Otto muttered, "We should have died fighting." Hans ignored him. "No," he said quietly, "we've fought enough." He took a slow breath, stepped into the open, and surrendered his Luger. The sergeant took it, inspecting the fine German engraving. "Nice piece," he said. "Too bad you lost." A ripple of bitter laughter went through the Americans. Hans's men stiffened, but Hans didn't react. He just looked at the sergeant, studying him. There was no malice in the man's tone, only a tired kind of victory. War had burned the hate out of him. By sunset, they were lined up beside the road under guard. The Americans passed out canteens of water, real water, cold, and for a moment Hans's pride cracked. He drank greedily, the coolness cutting through days of desert dust. Otto refused at first, but after a minute he gave in too. "Not what you expected, huh?" one of the guards said with a grin. Hans didn't answer. He'd been taught to think of Americans as soft, spoiled products of comfort and industry. Yet these men were lean, sunburned, efficient. They worked in silence, moving like parts of the same machine. As the last light faded, trucks rolled up. Painted across their sides were white stars. The prisoners were loaded aboard, hands bound loosely with rope. A jeep roared by, headlights cutting through the dark, and Hans caught a glimpse of something that made him pause, the endless stream of vehicles stretching for miles. "Gott im Himmel," Otto whispered. "How many trucks do they have?" Hans stared silently. He'd read reports, of course, about American production, their arsenal of democracy. But it was different to see it. The convoy never seemed to end. For every tank they destroyed, 10 more arrived. For every soldier killed, 2 replaced him within a week. And every truck, every tire, every bullet stamped, "Made in USA." That night they camped under the stars. The Americans built a small fire, cooked rations that actually smelled of meat, and even passed around coffee. Hans sat apart, his hands still bound, but his ears were sharp. "Hey, Sarge," one soldier said, "what we gonna do with all these Jerrys? We're running out of cages." "Ship 'em back to the States," the sergeant replied. "Let 'em pick apples or build roads. War'll be over before they even get homesick." "Back to the States," another man said, incredulous. "You serious? These fellas'll be eating steak while we're still here in the sand." A chorus of laughter followed, rough but good-natured. Hands blinked. America, they were sending prisoners across the ocean. It sounded absurd, but so had everything else in this war. He lay back on the sand, staring at the sky. The stars looked the same as they did over Bavaria, but the air was different, heavier, quieter, almost forgiving. For the first time in months, he felt the exhaustion truly hit him. By morning, they were marched to a temporary holding camp. Barbed wire, tents, and American flags snapping in the wind. A group of captured Italians was already there, laughing and smoking like men at a summer picnic. One of them waved. "Buongiorno, Fritz. Welcome to Club America." Hans said nothing, but even Otto cracked a grin. Inside the camp, a U.S. officer took down their names, rank and unit. Oberleutnant Hans Keller, Luftwaffe. "Luftwaffe, huh?" the officer smirked. "Guess the sky's closed today." Hans didn't reply, but the corner of his mouth twitched. The officer handed him a tag marked POW 7264. He studied it. "You treat all prisoners this way." "Depends," the officer said. "You boys play by the rules, you get food, water, maybe even cigarettes. You act up, you get nothing. Fair enough." It was more fairness than Hans expected. That night he noticed something strange. The Americans didn't post extra guards. They trusted the wire fence, the routine, and the simple fact that escape into the desert meant death. It wasn't arrogance, it was confidence born from resources. They had more of everything: trucks, guns, food, time. Hans envied that most of all. A few days later, the rumor became reality. They were being shipped to America. The announcement came from a young lieutenant with a clipboard and a clean uniform. "You men will be transported to a holding facility in the United States for the duration of the war. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Any attempt to escape will be unpleasant. Understood?" Silence. Then Otto spoke, his voice bitter. "To the land of jazz and Coca-Cola." The lieutenant smiled. "And assembly lines, don't forget those." That night Hans couldn't sleep. His mind was filled with images: New York skylines, endless factories, ships the size of cities. The Reich had told them America was a nation of weak consumers, ruled by chaos and greed. But the evidence, the tanks, the trucks, the men, told another story. He wondered, not for the first time, if they had underestimated the enemy. The transport began at dawn. They were herded onto trucks, then to a port. As the sun rose, Hans saw the ocean, endless, gray and glittering with ships. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Freighters, destroyers, transports, all moving in choreographed precision. It was like watching an industrial ballet. Each ship bore a name painted proudly on its bow: Liberty Bell, Victory Star, John Adams. Even the names seemed to hum with confidence. As Hans climbed aboard, he caught a glimpse of American sailors, young men joking, working, smoking. Each one a cog in a machine so vast it defied imagination. For every German ship sunk, 2 more like these were launched. The engines rumbled to life, deep and steady. The shoreline began to recede. Otto leaned on the railing beside him. "We'll see the Statue of Liberty soon," he said, half mocking, half curious. Hans didn't reply. He watched the horizon instead, the sea stretching endlessly westward. Behind him, the war burned on. Ahead of him, a land he'd only heard about in propaganda films awaited. For the first time since his capture, he felt something unexpected. Not fear, not anger, but curiosity. What kind of nation could fight a war like this? with laughter, steel, and food to spare. The thought lingered, carried on the sea breeze, as the ship turned toward the open Atlantic. And somewhere behind the clouds, the engines of American bombers thundered eastward, heading for the cities of his homeland. The Atlantic stretched endlessly in every direction, a rolling desert of gray and foam that swallowed the horizon whole, and in the middle of it steamed the Liberty ship SS Republic, her engines thrumming deep beneath the deck like the heartbeat of a metal giant. The German prisoners were quartered in the lower hold, a cavern of steel bulkheads, dim lights, and the constant rhythmic pounding of machinery that never stopped. For men who'd been raised on the order and rigidity of the Wehrmacht, the chaos of an American transport ship was bewildering, sailors shouting jokes across decks, jazz spilling from a radio somewhere, and the smell of coffee always drifting through the air, thick enough to make a man dizzy. Oberleutnant Hans Keller sat on his narrow bunk, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the steel floor vibrating under his boots. It had been 4 days since they left North Africa, and though the sea had been kind so far, the confinement gnawed at him. The Americans treated them well enough, better than he expected, but there was something almost frightening about how casual they were about everything. Their guards laughed, played cards, even shared cigarettes with the enemy as if war were just a temporary inconvenience, not the apocalypse Hans had seen it become. Across from him, Otto Meissner sat polishing his boots out of habit. "They don't even search us properly," Otto muttered. "They act like we're already harmless." Hans didn't look up. "Perhaps we are," Otto snorted. "Speak for yourself." A murmur of voices rippled through the hold as the sound of boots clanged overhead. The ship rocked slightly and a wave of nausea rolled through the prisoners. From somewhere above, a sailor's voice called, "Land sighted." The Germans stirred. Most hadn't seen anything but sand and sky for months. "Land," one whispered. "We can't be in America already." But the answer came quickly. "Newfoundland, just refueling." A ripple of disappointment passed through the men. America still felt like a myth, a rumor whispered through propaganda and dreams, but each day brought them closer to seeing whether that myth had teeth. Later, when the sun was dipping low and the Atlantic turned to molten silver, Hans was led topside under guard. It was supposed to be exercise time, but to him it felt like walking through a moving city. The deck teemed with life, sailors in grease-stained uniforms tightening ropes, mending gear, singing in rough, cheerful harmony. One of them, a young red-headed kid no older than 18, waved at him and grinned. "Enjoying the cruise, Lieutenant." The accent was thickly American, but the tone was teasing, not cruel. Hans almost smiled back but caught himself. He wasn't sure what disturbed him more, the friendliness or the confidence behind it. The Americans seemed to treat war like an inconvenience they could simply outproduce. They didn't talk about losing. They talked about when they'd win, as if the outcome were already printed in a factory manual somewhere. The convoy around them was enormous. Dozens of ships stretching to the horizon, gray hulks cutting through waves in perfect formation, each flying the same White Star flag. Above, fighter planes circled lazily. It was a show of force so massive that even Otto, who had mocked American machines, fell silent. "How many ships can one country build?" he muttered under his breath. Hans didn't answer. He was thinking of Germany's shipyards bombed, struggling for steel, rationing oil. And yet here on this endless sea, America's floating cities moved with the ease of giants. Every ship represented factories running day and night, women riveting steel, trains hauling coal across a continent. "They build like ants," Hans murmured. "Millions of them, and everyone knows his job." Otto scowled. "Ants can be crushed." Hans didn't reply, but he wasn't sure he believed that anymore. That night, as they lay in the hold listening to the deep pulse of the engines, the ship's radio crackled with music, Benny Goodman swinging through "Sing, Sing, Sing." The sound echoed through the steel corridors, wild and free, unlike anything German. Some prisoners covered their ears, others listened in silence, fascinated. Otto spat. "Noise." Hans smiled faintly. "Freedom." Otto gave him a dark look. "You sound almost envious." "Maybe I am." Hans closed his eyes and pictured cities that never slept, streets filled with cars, factories belching smoke not from destruction but from creation. What kind of people built this? People who could make war look effortless. The thought was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. A storm hit 3 nights later. The Atlantic, calm for so long, suddenly turned violent. Waves slammed against the hull like sledgehammers and the lights flickered. The prisoners clung to their bunks as the ship heaved and groaned. Buckets slid across the floor, one man vomited. Somewhere an engine backfired and the sound was mistaken for an explosion, sparking a moment of panic. Hans steadied himself, gripping the steel post beside him. "Calm," he barked in German. "This is not artillery." But his voice was drowned by the roar of water. For hours the storm raged, and the Americans above fought it with mechanical precision. Orders were shouted, ropes were hauled, and the engines never stopped. When morning came, the sea was calm again, as if nothing had happened. Hans looked at the sailors moving across the deck, exhausted but smiling, and realized that they hadn't even considered stopping. To them, storms were just another problem to fix. Days passed. The Germans adjusted to the rhythm of the ship. Meals came twice a day, thick soup, bread, sometimes even real meat. It was more than they'd eaten in weeks. "They feed prisoners like guests," Otto muttered. "It's obscene." "Or efficient," Hans countered. "A hungry man causes trouble. A full man works quietly." Otto grumbled but didn't argue. He'd noticed it too. The Americans didn't just fight with weapons, they fought with logistics. Every problem was solved with material, not ideology. And it worked. On the 10th day, the ship's engine slowed. The call came down. "Land ahead." The hold erupted in murmurs. Hans pushed through the crowd to the porthole. Through the salt-streaked glass, he saw it faint at first, then rising out of the mist. A shoreline, real land, trees, buildings, a harbor filled with cranes and warehouses. America. The dock stretched endlessly, and beyond it, rail lines, trucks, rows of men in coveralls unloading crates. Everything moved with purpose. No chaos, no hunger, just motion. As the prisoners were marched off the ship, Hans inhaled deeply. The air smelled of oil, salt, and iron, the smell of industry. He could hear engines everywhere, trains clattering, horns blaring. The docks buzzed like a machine. Even the American workers, stained with grease and sweat, carried themselves with a kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. They didn't salute officers or bow to anyone. They joked, argued, worked, and the system still ran perfectly. It was an entirely different world. "Welcome to New York," said one of the guards with a grin as they were herded toward waiting trains. Otto blinked. "This is New York," the guard laughed, "not the pretty part." But even this ugly part was magnificent. Warehouses larger than hangars, cranes swinging massive steel beams, trucks rolling past in endless lines. Every corner hummed with energy. Hans couldn't stop staring. "This," he whispered, "is how they win." Otto frowned. "By building, by never stopping." As the train doors slammed shut, the convoy began moving inland. The landscape changed, gray cities giving way to green fields, small towns, and rolling hills. At each station they passed, Hans saw more of the same: motion, progress, life. Farmers driving tractors, children waving flags, women loading freight cars. No ruins, no bomb craters, only production. It struck him then. Germany might have discipline, but America had momentum. Night fell and the prisoners dozed. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels sounded like an industrial lullaby. Across from Hans, a young German soldier whispered, "Do you think they'll kill us?" Hans shook his head. "No, they don't need to." "Then what will they do with us?" "Show us what we're fighting against." When dawn broke, the train rolled past a massive complex. Smokestacks, warehouses, endless rows of windows glowing with orange light. A sign flashed by in English, "Ford Motor Company." Hans leaned against the glass, transfixed. He'd heard of it, Ford, the industrial empire, but to see it was something else. Even in wartime, it moved like a living creature. Trucks rolled out of one building while planes were assembled in another. "They build airplanes and automobiles in the same place," Hans murmured. Otto looked unimpressed. "We build tanks." Hans gave a small, humorless smile. "Yes, and they build the world." By afternoon, the train slowed again. The guards shouted, "End of the line, welcome to Camp Concordia, Kansas." The doors slid open and hot prairie wind flooded in. The prisoners stepped out onto dry earth that stretched forever under a brilliant sky. Rows of wooden barracks lined the horizon, guarded but not grim. American soldiers lounged in the shade, rifles slung lazily. A few waved. "Howdy, boys, enjoy your new home." Hans felt something strange then, a pang of disbelief mixed with reluctant admiration. They weren't being dragged into some dungeon. They were being absorbed into a system so big it barely noticed them. A system that made war and comfort coexist in the same breath. For the first time, he understood that Germany could win battles, but America was fighting a different kind of war, a war of production, patience, and abundance. As the sun dipped behind the flat Kansas horizon, Hans looked around the camp, barbed wire glinting, guards laughing, trains still whistling in the distance, and thought of his homeland now burning under Allied bombs. "Maybe," he whispered, "this is what defeat looks like, not hunger or chains, but realization." Otto didn't hear him. He was staring at the mess hall where the smell of stew drifted through the air. "If this is prison," Otto said, "it's not half bad." Hans almost laughed. "No," he said softly, "it's worse, because now we see what they are capable of." The American flag above the camp flapped lazily in the evening wind. Somewhere far to the east, the war still raged, but here, in the heart of America, the machine never stopped. The Kansas wind had a voice of its own, endless, low, and heavy, like the slow breathing of the earth itself. And as the German prisoners marched through the gates of Camp Concordia, that wind carried the smell of dust, wheat, and engine oil. The camp was not what they expected. Instead of the grim, barbed wire hell they'd imagined, it looked more like a small town that happened to have fences. Rows of wooden barracks stood in neat lines, their roofs glinting in the sunlight. Trucks rumbled past carrying crates of supplies. American soldiers lounged by the mess hall sipping coffee from tin mugs. Hans Keller scanned the horizon. It stretched so far that it almost mocked him. No mountains, no ruins, no war, just the flat calm of a country untouched. "This place," Otto muttered beside him, "it doesn't even look like a prison." Hans's jaw tightened. "Maybe that's what makes it worse." The prisoners were counted, tagged, and divided into groups, but there was no shouting, no violence. The Americans processed them like they were inventory, not enemies. Each man received a blanket, a uniform marked PW, and a metal tray for meals. It was unnervingly efficient. When Hans finally stepped into his assigned barrack, he found clean bunks, electric lights, and even a radio mounted near the door. A radio for prisoners. It made no sense. The days settled into a rhythm almost too civilized to believe. Mornings began with roll call, followed by breakfast, oatmeal, bread, sometimes eggs. The guards didn't sneer or taunt. They cracked jokes, shared cigarettes, and even offered extra rations to men who worked hard. Hans couldn't decide whether to feel relieved or insulted. "They treat us like workers, not soldiers," Otto complained one morning as they were marched out to the fields. "Because that's what we are now," Hans replied. "Workers in their machine." The field stretched endlessly under the Kansas sun, dotted with tractors, combines, and rows of corn taller than a man's shoulder. The Germans were put to work harvesting, repairing fences, and loading grain into trucks. It was grueling labor, but there was a strange sense of purpose in it. The Americans didn't waste time on punishment. They used it to produce. Even the camp itself was run like an assembly line. Supplies in, goods out, no chaos. Every evening, Hans would look at the camp's central clock tower and think, this is how they win wars, by turning even captivity into productivity. It didn't take long for curiosity to replace fear. The Americans had built a small town just outside the camp, Concordia proper, and sometimes selected POWs were allowed to work there under supervision. Hans was one of them. His group was assigned to a local repair yard, fixing farm equipment under the watchful eye of a man named Tom Blake, a broad-shouldered mechanic with a voice like gravel and a smile that refused to quit. "You boys are better with tools than I expected," Tom said one day as Hans reassembled a tractor gearbox. "You'd fit right in if you weren't trying to kill us a few months ago." Hans didn't look up. "War changes purpose, not skill," Tom chuckled. "Fair point." The exchange became the foundation of an uneasy friendship. They didn't talk politics, they talked machines, torque, oil pressure, the beauty of clean engineering. For Hans, it was the first time in months that his hands had touched something that didn't destroy. Meanwhile, Otto and the others began to soften too, though none would admit it. They laughed more, complained less, even learned fragments of English. The guards noticed and treated them accordingly. When Christmas arrived, the Americans surprised the camp with something unthinkable, a celebration. They set up a tree, distributed candy, and even allowed the German prisoners to sing carols in their native tongue. For one night, enemies shared laughter. Hans stood near the tree watching snowflakes drift through the wire and felt something shift deep within him. He wasn't sure what it was, nostalgia, guilt, or gratitude, but it was real. "They shouldn't be this kind," Otto muttered beside him, half angry. "It makes us forget what we're supposed to hate." Hans nodded slowly. "Maybe that's the point." As winter passed into spring, the camp transformed again. The fields turned green, the work grew busier, and rumors began circulating among the POWs. Stories of German cities in ruins, of Allied armies closing in. Some refused to believe it. Others whispered about surrender, about Hitler's madness. For Hans, doubt had already taken root. He'd seen too much efficiency, too much strength here to believe the propaganda about American weakness. One afternoon, while repairing a combine, he overheard two local farmers talking nearby. "They got whole cities running on electricity back east now," one said proudly. "We'll be building cars and houses for 100 years after this war's done." Hans felt a chill. In Germany, people were hiding in basements, praying for food. Here, they were already dreaming about what came after victory. That night, as the camp lights flickered off one by one, he wrote in his small notebook, something forbidden but tolerated. "They are winning because they never stopped building, even during destruction. We destroy to win, they build to win." But not everyone saw it that way. A handful of die-hard officers within the camp still clung to Nazi ideals. They whispered in corners, plotted resistance, and painted swastikas on walls at night. One of them, Hauptmann Vogel, confronted Hans near the mess hall. "You've gone soft," Vogel hissed. "You talk like an American now." Hans met his gaze calmly. "I talk like a man who's seen the truth," Vogel sneered. "Traitor." The next day, Hans found his bunk ransacked and his notebook torn. He didn't report it. The Americans wouldn't understand, and he didn't want to make enemies of his own people. But that night, when Vogel started shouting about German pride during roll call, the guards didn't even raise their rifles. They just waited until he was done, then quietly walked away. Discipline without fear. It was something Hans had never seen before. Weeks later, the camp received a visit from a group of American officers and reporters. They toured the facilities, photographed the prisoners working, even interviewed a few for propaganda purposes. Hans was chosen because of his rank and English skills. A young reporter with bright eyes asked, "What do you think of life in America, Lieutenant?" Hans paused, choosing his words carefully. "Efficient," he said finally. "Too efficient." The reporter smiled. "Is that a compliment?" Hans's lips curved faintly. "It's an observation." That interview later appeared in a small-town newspaper, and Tom showed him the clipping with pride. "Look at you," Tom said, slapping him on the back. "Kansas celebrity." Hans only shook his head, but inside he felt something strange, pride, maybe, or confusion that his enemy wanted his story told at all. By summer, the prisoners were being rotated to different work sites. Hans and Otto were reassigned to a local grain elevator, massive, towering silos that dominated the landscape like cathedrals of modern industry. It was there that Hans fully understood America's scale. Trains arrived daily, loaded with wheat from across the plains and left within hours, bound for cities hundreds of miles away. Nothing stood still. Even the machinery seemed alive, roaring and humming like some industrial god. "They don't build monuments," Hans said one day, watching conveyor belts clatter. "They build engines." Otto followed his gaze. "Engines can break." Hans smiled faintly. "Yes, but theirs are designed to be repaired before they do." And yet beneath the order and progress, a quiet tension remained. The POWs began hearing rumors: Germany's collapse, Hitler's death, surrender negotiations. The camp grew restless. Some men cheered secretly at night, others sank into silence. Hans felt a hollow ache he couldn't name. If the war was ending, what would happen to them? Could he go back? Would he even want to? One night, unable to sleep, he walked to the edge of the wire. Beyond it lay miles of wheat glowing under moonlight. The guard in the nearest tower glanced down, recognized him, and simply nodded. No words, no warning. Hans realized he could run. He could vanish into that endless land, but he didn't. Where would he go? The war was over for him, whether he wanted it or not. The next morning, Tom brought him a newspaper, Germany Surrenders. Hans read the headline 3 times before setting it down. "It's over," Tom said quietly. "Guess that means you'll be heading home soon." Hans didn't answer. Home. The word felt foreign now. "Do you think," Hans asked finally, "a man can go home if he no longer believes in it?" Tom thought for a long time, then shrugged. "You can always build a new one." That evening, as the camp loudspeakers played soft jazz and the prisoners watched the sunset through the wire, Hans felt both free and trapped at once. The war had taken his loyalty, his pride, and his fear, but it had given him understanding. America's true weapon wasn't the bomb, the tank, or the gun. It was motion, constant, relentless motion, and the belief that work, not ideology, could rebuild anything. Otto sat beside him silently, smoking. "So this is it," he said. "The end." Hans shook his head. "No," he whispered. "For them, it's only the beginning." And as the stars rose over the quiet Kansas plains, the once proud Luftwaffe officer found himself thinking not of conquest or vengeance, but of machines, farms, and the strange, unstoppable hum of American progress that had already begun remaking the world. By the time autumn rolled around in 1944, the captured German soldiers had begun to notice something strange about America. It wasn't just the endless fields or the abundance of food. It was the rhythm of life that seemed to hum with invisible energy, a kind of silent confidence that no bomb or blockade could extinguish. The prisoners in Camp Florence were given tasks that, while simple, revealed glimpses of this power. Building fences, repairing machinery, and occasionally working alongside local farmers who treated them with surprising civility. Otto Müller, who had once manned a Panzer's radio during the Blitz across France, now found himself oiling the gears of a combine harvester under the Arizona sun. He would pause sometimes, his gaze distant, thinking about how the Führer had described Americans as lazy, decadent fools. Yet here they were, producing food, steel, and machines at a pace that defied logic. "They build faster than we can destroy," whispered his comrade Weber one day, standing beside a line of trucks carrying new machinery bound for the war effort. In the evenings, they'd sit behind the wire fences, watching freight trains thunder by, dozens of cars long, stacked with crates, tanks, and artillery, all bound for Europe or the Pacific. The guards didn't hide this. In fact, they let the prisoners see it. Perhaps it was deliberate, a message. This is what you're up against. Otto began to feel it deep down, that all the propaganda about a weak, divided America had been a lie. He'd seen the factories from the train, the endless rail lines cutting through vast plains, and the cities glowing at night with light so bright it hurt his eyes. One day, a guard named Thompson, who spoke enough German to joke awkwardly, handed Otto a copy of Life magazine. On the cover was a photograph of women assembling aircraft parts, women, not soldiers. "Rosie the Riveter," the guard said proudly. Otto flipped through the pages, stunned by the pictures. Women in overalls building bombers, men returning from shifts to schools where their children studied under electric lights, and advertisements for cars, radios, and refrigerators, luxuries unthinkable in wartime Germany. He realized that the Americans had mastered something the Reich had overlooked, not just war production, but the ability to make every citizen part of the machine, every hand contributing to victory. Weber, ever cynical, refused to believe it. "Propaganda," he muttered. "They show us only what they want us to see." But even Weber faltered when they were assigned to repair wooden crates for munitions, and saw the sheer volume of them stacked sky-high in the depot. Every week, trains arrived empty and left full. It was like watching an ocean tide that never stopped. The camp commander, an older major with calm eyes, sometimes strolled by the fence and spoke casually with them. "You boys thought Germany had industry," he said one afternoon, tipping his hat. "Son, you haven't seen Detroit yet." The word Detroit became almost mythical in the camp. Rumors spread that in that city, they built an airplane every hour, a tank every 30 minutes, and bullets by the ton. Otto thought about Berlin's factories, crippled by air raids, and compared them to the clean, efficient production lines he'd seen in American photographs. He felt a cold realization creep through him. This was a war Germany could never win. The shock deepened when they were taken to assist in unloading supplies at a nearby rail yard. There, under the watch of armed guards, they saw convoys of American trucks stretching to the horizon, every one of them freshly painted, perfectly maintained. Even the crates were uniform, stamped with neat block letters. U.S. Army property. Otto touched one and felt the smoothness of the wood, the precision of its construction. In Germany, by that stage, they were building weapons out of desperation, substituting steel with scrap and training boys who still looked like schoolchildren. Here, it felt endless: fuel, tools, food, medicine, all produced with clockwork efficiency. Later, back at the camp, when mail arrived, the guards sometimes let them read translated snippets of Stars and Stripes or local newspapers. Otto read about football games, movie premieres, and factory bonuses, as if the war barely touched their everyday lives. It was surreal. Back home, families hid in basements during air raids, cities lay in ruins, and ration cards were gold. Here, they laughed, worked, built, and somehow kept living as if the world wasn't burning. Weeks turned into months, and what started as curiosity transformed into respect, even envy. When Christmas came, the guards set up a small tree in the mess hall and shared coffee and cigarettes with the POWs. Otto sat quietly, listening to the faint sound of a radio playing Bing Crosby's "I'll Be Home for Christmas." The melody pierced his chest. For the first time, he didn't feel like an enemy, just a man far from home, realizing that everything he'd been told about these people was wrong. That night, he wrote in his hidden diary, "We thought they were soft, but they are strong because they don't need to be cruel." After the holidays, the camp received a delivery of new machinery, massive Caterpillar tractors that the POWs would help unload. The sight of them nearly silenced everyone. These machines were beasts, built with such power and precision that Otto whispered, "If the Americans ever build tanks like this, the war will end in months." A guard overheard him and simply nodded. "They already are," he said. Otto didn't sleep that night. The rumble of distant trains felt like thunder rolling across a continent that never slept, a machine with a soul made of steel and light. He realized then that Germany had underestimated not just a country, but an idea, one that could build 1,000 planes while feeding millions, one that fought with factories as much as it did with soldiers. One afternoon, as Otto was stacking crates near the camp fence, he saw a small American boy riding his bicycle past the barbed wire. The boy waved. Otto hesitated, then raised his hand slowly in return. The boy's smile was effortless, fearless. It hit Otto harder than any bomb. This was what they were fighting against, and this was what they had already lost. Freedom wasn't a word painted on propaganda posters here. It was lived, breathed, and built into every road, every radio, every engine. Later that night, he spoke softly to Weber, who stared into the desert beyond the fence. "Do you still think we'll win?" Weber didn't answer for a long time. Then finally, he whispered, "I don't even know what winning means anymore." And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the trains kept rolling, Otto Müller, once a proud soldier of the Third Reich, sat in silence, humbled not by defeat in battle, but by the sight of a world so vast, efficient, and unbroken that even a prisoner behind barbed wire could feel its pulse. The laughter of German pilots over the radio once mocked the American machines, but now, in the quiet heart of a foreign land, Otto could hear the real engine of victory, the relentless hum of a nation that simply refused to stop moving. By the spring of 1945, Whispers of Germany's collapse rippled through the POW camp like dry wind over barbed wire, carrying with them a strange blend of disbelief and dread that settled in the hearts of the captured soldiers. Otto Müller had stopped asking for updates from the guards. He could see it written in their faces now, quiet sympathy instead of hostility, a kind of knowing patience reserved for men whose world had already ended. The newspaper clippings pinned to the mess hall bulletin board spoke louder than any announcement. Berlin encircled, Hitler's bunker bombed, Allied forces liberate camps. Otto stared at the grainy black and white photos of ruined cities, smoke rising from familiar skylines, and children clutching their mothers amid rubble. Each image felt like a blade carving away another piece of the illusion he once called pride. Weber, his cynical comrade, tried to maintain his sneer, muttering, "It's propaganda again." But his voice cracked when a guard quietly confirmed that the Führer's inner circle was either dead or captured. The myth of the invincible Reich was collapsing like a rotted beam under its own lies. Life at Camp Florence shifted subtly but unmistakably. The guards grew friendlier, less formal, even joking with the prisoners as if trying to ease them into a new reality. The Americans had begun talking about re-education, offering classes in English, history, even democracy. To Otto, the word itself sounded alien, democracy, as though it belonged to some mythical creature too idealistic to exist. But curiosity gnawed at him. He attended a few sessions led by an elderly professor who'd once taught at a university before the war. "In your country," the man said gently, "obedience was seen as virtue. Here, questioning power is." Otto found the idea unsettling, even dangerous, yet strangely liberating. When the professor asked him what he believed in, Otto hesitated, realizing he no longer knew. He had once believed in duty, honor, and victory, but those words now felt hollow. Watching the Americans move about their lives, guards chatting with farmers, families driving by in pickup trucks, church bells ringing freely on Sundays, Otto began to sense that true strength didn't come from fear or control, but from a system that allowed its people to dream without permission. The camp's work detail had shifted too. Instead of unloading ammunition, the POWs were now helping build irrigation systems and planting crops. Otto found comfort in the rhythm of the labor, the soil warm under his fingers, the sky wide and merciful. The guards didn't bark orders. They worked alongside them, sweating, laughing, even sharing sandwiches at noon. It was the first time Otto had ever shared a meal with his supposed enemy without feeling like one. He'd heard stories of Allied POWs in Germany beaten, starved, humiliated, and couldn't reconcile that cruelty with the humanity shown here. Once, during a water break, a guard named Thompson offered him a sip from his canteen and said, "War's just a job someone else started. We all just want to go home." Otto nodded, unable to reply, but those words burrowed deep into his conscience. Then came the day that changed everything. One morning, a convoy of trucks pulled into the camp, carrying boxes marked U.S. Army Information Bureau. Inside were films, projectors, and reels labeled Concentration Camps, Europe. The guards set up a makeshift theater in the recreation hall and announced that the prisoners were required to watch. Weber scoffed. "More American lies," he said, but even he sat down, arms crossed. When the film began, silence fell. The images that flickered on the wall were not propaganda, they were horror. Emaciated bodies stacked like firewood, children with hollow eyes staring at the camera, crematoriums still smoldering. Otto's stomach twisted. He wanted to look away but couldn't. The smell of dust and diesel in the hall suddenly seemed unbearable. When the reel ended, no one moved. Even the guards stood pale-faced, the projector's hum filling the silence like a funeral hymn. Weber stood slowly, trembling. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "They faked it, they must have." But his words died when he saw the tears in Otto's eyes. The truth had finally broken through the last wall of denial. That night Otto couldn't sleep. The desert wind rattled the fence, carrying faint echoes of train whistles from the distance. And for the first time, those sounds reminded him not of industry, but of the trains that had carried millions to their deaths. He felt a sickness in his chest, a weight heavier than any uniform he'd ever worn. How had he not seen it? How had so many men like him fought so blindly, so proudly, for something so monstrous? When dawn came, he sat by the fence, staring at the horizon. The rising sun burned bright against the wire, and for a moment it looked like the light was breaking through. The next day the camp commander gathered them all and announced that Germany had surrendered. "The war is over," he said simply. No shouts, no cheers, just silence. Otto felt both relief and an ache that defied words. Weber turned to him, eyes hollow, and muttered, "So what now?" Otto didn't answer. He didn't know. Some of the prisoners cried openly. Others stood motionless, staring at the ground as if the earth itself had betrayed them. The guards didn't mock or celebrate, they just gave them space. Later that evening, Thompson approached Otto with a small envelope. "Mail from Washington," he said. Inside was a pamphlet titled "Rebuilding Germany, A New Future." Otto read it over and over. It spoke of rebuilding homes, schools, and communities under democratic principles. The words sounded naive at first, yet each line carried a strange sincerity. Over the following weeks, the camp began to change. The barbed wire remained, but the tension that had once hung in the air dissolved into something resembling coexistence. American officers spoke of sending the POWs home in waves. Some men cheered, others dreaded it, knowing that home no longer existed as they remembered it. Otto fell somewhere in between. He had lost faith in the Reich but not in humanity. He watched as American families came to donate food and clothing to the prisoners, ordinary citizens who owed them nothing but offered kindness anyway. One woman brought her young daughter, who handed Otto a folded piece of paper. On it was a child's drawing, two men shaking hands, one in a helmet, the other with a shovel, under the words "Peace soon." Otto felt something loosen in his chest, a quiet tear sliding down his cheek before he could stop it. As the weeks turned into months, the camp grew quieter, emptier. Repatriation began, and Otto's name appeared on the list for the next transport. He should have felt joy, but instead he felt a strange pull not toward Germany but toward understanding. He wanted to see Detroit, the city the guards had spoken of, to witness firsthand the heartbeat of this industrial giant that had defeated his homeland not through hatred, but through relentless creation. The night before his departure, he walked along the fence one last time, tracing the wire with his fingertips. Beyond it, the lights of the nearby town twinkled under the desert sky. Freedom, he thought, wasn't just the absence of fences. It was the ability to build something better once they were gone. When dawn broke, he boarded the transport truck with the others. The road out of Camp Florence stretched long and dusty, cutting through the vast American landscape that had both humbled and taught him. As they drove past fields, towns, and factories humming with life, Otto turned to Weber and said quietly, "They never needed to conquer the world. They just built one worth living in." Weber didn't respond, but for the first time in months, he didn't scoff either. And as the convoy disappeared into the horizon, the rising sun glinting off the metal of their helmets, Otto Müller understood that the true power of America hadn't been in its weapons or factories, but in its faith in work, in freedom, in the idea that creation was stronger than destruction. The laughter of German pilots, once proud and scornful, was now just an echo fading into history, while the thunder of American engines roared on, carrying not vengeance, but the promise of rebuilding a broken world.